A lone figure steps out of the darkness and approaches the front door of a quiet suburban home. The time is exactly 1:47 in the morning. This intruder is entirely concealed behind a mask and carries a specific 25-liter Ozark Trail backpack. With chilling precision, the figure reaches up and severs the connection to the doorbell camera. The digital eye goes blind. The feed cuts to black. Behind that heavy front door, an 84-year-old woman is sleeping alone. When the sun rises, she will be completely gone. There will be no ransom note left on the kitchen counter. There will be no signs of a chaotic struggle ripping through the living room. There will only be a terrifying void where a life used to be. The digital trail that modern society relies upon has been intentionally and systematically erased. We live in an era where every movement is tracked by satellites and smart devices, but this intruder knew exactly how to create a blind spot. Who took her into the desert night? Why did they need her digital footprint wiped from existence before they made their move? The answers lie hidden within a fragmented timeline and a haunting collection of forensic evidence that investigators are still desperately trying to piece together. If you want to follow the verified evidence trail as we uncover the truth behind this chilling disappearance, be sure to subscribe and join us as we dive deep into the darkness to understand how someone can simply vanish from one of the most heavily monitored neighborhoods in the state. We have to look closely at the meticulously planned moments leading up to the camera going black. It requires examining the exact sequence of events that transformed a peaceful residence into a perfectly executed crime scene. The calculated nature of the camera disconnection tells a story of premeditation. The specific choice of the Ozark Trail backpack suggests preparation for carrying something significant away from the property. Every single detail matters when the primary witness is a severed wire and a blank screen. The investigation immediately faces a monumental hurdle because the very technology designed to protect the homeowner has been turned into a weapon of concealment. We must ask ourselves, what kind of predator knows exactly where to find the camera blind spots? Despite relying on modern technology to monitor every aspect of her health and security, Nancy Guthrie lived a surprisingly isolated physical existence in her highly affluent neighborhood. She was 84 years old and resided alone within the quiet wealth of the Catalina Foothills. The anomaly of her routine became glaringly apparent on the evening before she disappeared. She had taken an Uber to attend a dinner earlier that evening, demonstrating her independence and reliance on digital ride-sharing services. Yet the return journey broke from that pattern. She was driven back to her heavily fortified home by her son-in-law at exactly 9:48 in the evening. This shift from public transit to a private family ride home marked the final verified physical sighting of Nancy. Her daily life was a stark contrast between extreme digital connectivity and profound physical solitude. Her residence was equipped with multiple smart cameras designed to alert her to any movement on her property. She wore a medical device, specifically a pacemaker that continuously transmitted her vital biometric data to medical professionals. She was tethered to the outside world through invisible wireless signals that promised safety and immediate assistance should anything go wrong. The Catalina Foothills is a community built on the illusion of impenetrable security. The houses are spaced far apart, surrounded by desert landscaping that offers both privacy and isolation. Neighbors are kept at a distance by long driveways and heavy doors. The community relies on the deterrent of visible surveillance to keep the outside world at bay. Nancy trusted this invisible digital shield to protect her physical vulnerability. She was an elderly woman living alone in a sprawling house, entirely dependent on the assumption that the glowing lights of her cameras would keep the darkness outside. Her routine was predictable and cataloged by the devices she surrounded herself with. She moved through her days, leaving a constant stream of data points for anyone who knew how to look for them. The Uber receipts logged her travel. The doorbell camera time-stamped her arrivals and departures. The pacemaker recorded the steady rhythm of her heart. To the casual observer, she was perfectly safe, enveloped in a cocoon of modern monitoring. But this reliance on technology created a dangerous, false sense of security. The digital fortress she built around herself was completely reliant on continuous power and unbroken internet connections. It was a fragile web of protection that could be dismantled by anyone with enough knowledge and malicious intent. She went to sleep that night believing the cameras were watching over her property. She believed her medical device would alert the authorities if her heart faltered. She had no way of knowing that her comprehensive digital footprint was not a shield, but rather a map for someone, hunting in the shadows. The very systems designed to broadcast her safety were about to be silenced one by one. The sprawling desert estates of the Catalina Foothills offer a specific type of wealthy seclusion that isolates residents from the immediate help of neighbors. When you live behind high walls and rely entirely on silicon and wires for protection, a physical breach becomes catastrophic. The silence of the desert night swallowed any sounds of approach. The distance between the homes meant that a scream would simply vanish into the dry air. She was a woman anchored to life by technology, but physically floating alone in a vast, empty space. Her home was fortified by modern digital shields, but those very shields were about to be weaponized against her, leaving her utterly defenseless in the dark. The first fracture in the illusion of safety occurred the very next morning, when Nancy failed to log on for her scheduled virtual church service. For a woman whose life was so meticulously organized and digitally tethered, this absence was an immediate red flag. The community she interacted with online waited for her screen to illuminate, but it remained dark. This digital absence triggered the physical search that would soon unravel a terrifying timeline. Law enforcement officials from the Pima County Sheriff Department were dispatched to the Catalina Foothills estate. They arrived at a property that outwardly appeared completely undisturbed. The desert sun baked the quiet driveway, and the heavy front door remained firmly shut. But as investigators began to pull the digital records, a chilling sequence of events emerged from the data logs. The timeline narrowed with frightening precision. Official records confirmed that the heavy garage door of the residence closed at exactly 9:50 in the evening, just 2 minutes after her son-in-law reportedly dropped her off. From that moment forward, the house was locked down for the night. The digital perimeter was active and recording. For several hours, the data reflected a peaceful, dormant household. Then the logs revealed the terrifying intrusion. At exactly 1:47 in the morning, the masked figure stepped into the frame of the doorbell, camera, and severed the connection. The primary visual record of the property was instantly terminated. This deliberate act of sabotage plunged the investigation into a critical blind spot. The authorities were suddenly faced with a massive gap in the timeline. They knew exactly when the camera was killed, but they had no visual record of what happened next. The investigators meticulously combed through every available surrounding data point, trying to bracket the unknown. They established a horrifying window of opportunity. The intruder had absolute control over the physical environment from the moment the camera died. The quiet desert night provided the perfect acoustic cover for whatever violent actions unfolded inside the home. Every minute that passed after 1:47 was a minute where the intruder operated with total impunity. The structural integrity of the home had been breached, not with brute force, but with calculated technical precision. The authorities realized they were not just looking for a missing person. They were hunting an individual who understood how to blind a modern security system. The digital blackout was a loud declaration of intent. It meant the perpetrator knew the layout of the security measures and came prepared to neutralize them. The timeline was no longer just a sequence of hours and minutes. It was a ticking clock of escalating dread. The investigators stared at the blank data logs, knowing that the answers were trapped within that void. The physical search of the house yielded confusing results at first glance. There were no immediate signs of a frantic struggle in the main living areas. The silence of the house was oppressive. It was as if she had simply evaporated into the arid Arizona air. But the complete absence of a physical trail only highlighted the sinister nature of the digital erasure. The 47 minutes represent a meticulously planned operational window. Within that narrow time frame, the intruder had to navigate the interior of the unfamiliar house, locate the sleeping victim, secure her, and transport her out of the residence without triggering any secondary alarms or alerting the distant neighbors. The sheer logistical complexity of moving an adult human body out of a secured estate in total silence suggests a terrifying level of rehearsal. The authorities mapped the possible exit routes, calculating the time it would take to drag or carry a victim down, the long driveway to a waiting vehicle. Every second of those 47 minutes was weaponized against the victim. The darkness was absolute and intentional. The void in the timeline remains the most haunting piece of the puzzle, staring back at the detectives. The timeline is firmly locked into a terrifying 47-minute window of complete darkness, where the fate of an 84-year-old woman was sealed by an unseen predator. As the sun climbed higher over the Catalina Foothills, the meticulous search of the property finally shattered the facade of a peaceful disappearance. Investigators moving carefully across the exterior of the estate made a chilling discovery that instantly escalated the severity of the crisis. Near the threshold of the front porch, stark against the pristine surface, they found fresh drops of blood. This physical evidence was undeniable and deeply alarming. It was the first tangible proof of violence, tearing through the deliberate silence of the crime scene. The blood drops were small, but their implications were massive. They indicated an injury, a struggle, or a forced removal that occurred just outside the heavily fortified doors. The crime scene technicians immediately secured the area, photographing and swabbing the crimson stains, hoping the biological material would yield a microscopic clue to the identity of the attacker or the condition of the victim. But the blood on the porch was only the first half of a devastating dual revelation. While forensics teams scoured the physical ground, digital investigators were urgently pulling the biometric logs from Nancy Guthrie's medical providers. They needed to know if her pacemaker was still broadcasting its vital rhythm from somewhere out in the desert or within the city limits. The data retrieval process felt agonizingly slow, but when the report finally materialized, the contents were catastrophic. The digital logs confirmed a horrifying synchronized event. At the exact same time, the intruder was operating in the dark. Just shortly after the doorbell camera was manually disconnected, the life-saving pacemaker abruptly stopped transmitting all data. The steady electronic heartbeat that had been pulsing through the wireless networks simply vanished. The device did not register a gradual decline or a natural cessation of a heart rhythm. The transmission was violently and abruptly terminated. The dual shock of the physical blood on the porch and the sudden catastrophic silencing of the internal medical device painted a gruesome picture of the events that transpired in the dark. The sudden loss of the pacemaker signal meant the device was either destroyed, damaged in a violent physical altercation, or moved into an area completely shielded from all wireless communication networks. The investigators were forced to confront the darkest possible scenarios. The blood and the silence combined to form a deafening alarm. This was no longer a case of a missing elderly woman. It was undeniably a violent, forced abduction with a high probability of a fatal outcome. The terrifying precision of the camera being blinded, followed by the violent cessation of the internal medical monitor, showed a predator who controlled both the physical and digital domains. The realization that a device embedded inside a human chest could be silenced so quickly sent a chill through the law enforcement command center. The technicians stared at the flat line on their screens, trying to comprehend the sheer physical force required to cause such an instantaneous failure. Medical experts were consulted urgently to determine exactly what kind of trauma could produce that specific data anomaly. The consensus was grim and offered no comfort to the searching officers. The abrupt loss of signal was an electronic scream echoing into the void. The blood drops outside seemed to answer that scream, confirming that the violence had spilled out of the house and into the cold night air. The combination of these two brutal facts left no room for optimistic theories or hopeful misunderstandings. If you think this precise timeline and the precise timeline, calculated destruction of the digital monitors points to someone who intimately knew her schedule, and her vulnerabilities, hit the like button to let us know. The authorities were standing on a blood-stained porch, holding a completely blank medical report, realizing that the perpetrator had successfully erased the victim from both the physical world and the digital spectrum simultaneously. The shockwave of this realization fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of the manhunt, shifting it from a search and rescue operation to a desperate pursuit of a phantom. The undeniable evidence of a violent abduction immediately escalated the jurisdictional response, bringing the full weight of federal law enforcement down upon the Catalina Foothills. The Federal Bureau of Investigation officially stepped in, joining forces with the Pima County Sheriff Department to manage the sprawling and complex crime scene. The arrival of federal agents signaled a massive shift in resources and investigative tactics. The driveway of the quiet estate was suddenly crowded with mobile command centers and forensic vans. The FBI brought advanced digital forensics teams specifically trained to hunt for ghosts in the data streams. The sheer scale of the response reflected the terrifying nature of the crime. An 84-year-old woman had been taken by force, and the perpetrator had vanished without leaving a clear physical trail. As the federal Agents began their meticulous reconstruction of the timeline, their attention naturally and inevitably turned toward the inner circle of the victim. In any investigation involving a sudden disappearance, statistics and protocol dictate that detectives must first look at those closest to the target. The public scrutiny immediately zeroed in on the last two people verified to have seen Nancy Guthrie alive. The spotlight burned intensely on her daughter Annie and her son-in-law Tommaso Cioni. The fact that Tommaso had driven her home at 9:48 in the evening placed him squarely at the center of the timeline, just hours before the digital blackout occurred. The initial phase of the FBI investigation is always an uncomfortable and highly invasive process for the family members left behind. Detectives must ask the hardest questions and demand verifiable alibis for every minute of the night in question. They pulled phone records for both Annie and Tommaso, looking for any anomalies in their location data or communication patterns during the critical 47-minute window. Financial records were subpoenaed to determine if there was a hidden motive buried in bank statements or inheritance documents. The pressure on the family was immense and compounded by the glaring media attention that had descended upon the wealthy community. News vans parked at the perimeter of the neighborhood, broadcasting the grim details of the blood and the silenced pacemaker to a horrified national audience. The narrative forming in the public eye was fueled by suspicion of the family. It is a common true crime trope that the spouse, or the closest relative, is usually the culprit, and the internet detectives were quick to cast blame on the daughter and son-in-law. The investigators, however, could not rely on public opinion or statistical probability. They needed hard forensic proof. They subjected the family to grueling interrogations designed to expose any inconsistencies in their accounts of that evening. Every detail of the dinner, the drive home, and the subsequent morning was analyzed and cross-examined. The agents looked for micro-expressions of deception and listened for the slight hesitations that often betray a lie. The focus on the family was methodical and unyielding, because if the threat came from inside the house, the entire nature of the security breach would be explained. An insider would know exactly where the camera blind spots were and how to neutralize the medical monitors without causing a commotion. The theory made logical sense and provided a clean narrative for the investigators to pursue. The physical proximity of the son-in-law to the victim just before the attack made him the most obvious focal point of the early probe. The detectives pushed hard, trying to find the crack in the familial foundation that might have led to such a brutal outcome. The tension within the interrogation rooms was thick with suspicion and the desperate need for answers. The authorities were determined to rule the family in or out with absolute certainty before expanding the search grid into the wider, unknown desert. The federal agents deployed specialized evidence response teams to grid search the miles of arid terrain surrounding the property. They brought in tracking dogs and thermal imaging drones, hoping to catch a heat signature or a scent trail that the human eye had missed. The massive allocation of federal assets underscored the high stakes of the manhunt. Every agent on the ground understood that the survival window for an 84-year-old victim of a violent abduction was rapidly closing. The neighborhood itself transformed into a fortress of law enforcement activity, with checkpoints and continuous patrols disrupting the usually serene environment. The residents watched from behind their locked doors, terrified by the realization that their wealth and security systems had failed to keep the monsters out. The heavy atmosphere of suspicion hung over the entire community, while the FBI systematically dismantled the lives of the family members searching for a single grain of truth. The most obvious suspects are placed under an incredibly intense microscope, but the forensic evidence, waiting in the dark, is about to force a massive and unexpected pivot in the entire investigation. The intensive scrutiny directed at the closest relatives reached a definitive and highly publicized conclusion. Both the daughter and the son-in-law submitted to comprehensive polygraph examinations administered by federal experts. These tests are grueling psychological endurance trials designed to break down deceptive narratives through physiological stress. The results were conclusive. Following days of relentless pressure and public speculation, the local sheriff department issued a formal statement completely and officially clearing the immediate family of any involvement. They had fully cooperated with every invasive demand of the probe. This official exoneration forced a terrifying paradigm shift upon the surrounding community, with the domestic threat definitively ruled out. The horrifying reality set in like a winter freeze. A complete stranger, a highly organized predator, was actively hunting within their exclusive enclave. This realization shattered whatever lingering comfort the neighbors harbored. If it was not an inside job, then the perpetrator was an external phantom who had meticulously studied the neighborhood and successfully breached its defenses. The investigative pivot was immediate and massive. Since the inner circle was clean, the answer had to lie somewhere in the vast expanse of the surrounding desert. Search. Teams expanded their grid significantly, moving outward from the epicenter of the crime scene in widening concentric circles. It was during this grueling systematic sweep of the rugged terrain that a breakthrough occurred. Exactly 2 miles away from the initial site, resting conspicuously against the dry earth, searchers located a single discarded glove. In the sterile context of forensic analysis, an isolated item of clothing found along a potential escape route is a monumental discovery. It represents a rare mistake, a moment where the meticulous planning of the perpetrator unraveled just enough to leave a physical trace. Crime scene technicians approached the item with extreme caution, treating the surrounding dirt as a highly sensitive biological zone. The glove was meticulously bagged and rushed to the state crime laboratory for advanced processing. The hope was that the coarse fabric had trapped microscopic skin cells or sweat during the chaotic extraction of the victim. Days passed with agonizing slowness as the laboratory technicians worked to extract a viable profile from the weathered material. When the results finally returned from the lab, they delivered a shockwave that fundamentally altered the manhunt. The technicians successfully isolated a clear genetic profile, but the DNA belonged to an unidentified male. It was a complete unknown. The genetic sequence was immediately run through the national criminal databases, but it generated absolutely zero matches. The perpetrator was a ghost in the system. This lack of a match indicated that the attacker might not have a prior felony record, or at least had never been compelled to provide a genetic sample to the authorities. The discovery of the unknown DNA on the glove, isolated 2 miles away from the property, solidified the theory of a stranger. Abduction. The authorities now possessed the biological signature of the monster, but they had no name and no face to attach to it. This single piece of evidence became the cornerstone of the entire pursuit. The sheer terror of the situation amplified as the reality sank in. A highly capable individual who leaves no digital footprint and possesses no criminal history was responsible for bypassing the security systems and disappearing into the night. The implications were staggering and deeply unsettling for everyone involved in the search. The investigators were no longer looking for a familiar face, harboring a secret grudge. They were hunting a disciplined outsider who had managed to execute a flawless intrusion and extraction. The tension within the command center escalated as they realized the magnitude of the challenge before them. They had a microscopic piece of the attacker, but the vast desert still hid the victim. If you have any theories on how someone could execute such a complex operation without leaving a broader trail, share your thoughts in the comments below. The discovery of the glove shifted the narrative from a domestic tragedy to a hunt for an apex predator. The authorities knew they needed more than a microscopic genetic profile to track down a suspect who was clearly skilled at evasion. They needed to understand the preparatory steps the attacker took before launching the final assault. They needed to find the surveillance trail that led up to the violent intrusion. The focus turned outward, scanning the neighborhood for any overlooked digital eyes that might have captured a fleeting glimpse of the phantom. The massive federal resources were redirected from the family to the surrounding community, looking for a single anomaly in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. The meticulous search for external digital clues yielded a discovery that sent a cold shock through the investigative ranks. Federal agents began a massive canvass of every security camera mounted on surrounding estates, expanding their net far beyond the immediate days preceding the crime. They requested weeks of archived footage from neighbors who lived blocks away. As analysts scrubbed through hundreds of hours of mundane neighborhood activity, they found something deeply disturbing. On January, 11 weeks before the actual event, a camera situated down the street captured a distinct figure moving through the shadows. The analysts froze the frame. It was the same masked suspect wearing identical clothing to the night of the intrusion. The figure was recorded standing perfectly still, observing the target residence from a distance. The analysts continued their grueling review and found another chilling recording. On January 24, the same individual was captured again, this time closer to the property line, methodically testing the site, lines, and assessing the vulnerabilities of the perimeter. These archival recordings transform the entire narrative of the case. The abduction was not a random crime of opportunity executed by a passing transient. It was a highly calculated, weeks-long surveillance operation. The predator had stalked the property, meticulously learning the routines, identifying the camera blind spots, and planning the precise logistics of the assault. The victim had been specifically targeted and hunted over a prolonged period. This revelation added a layer of profound dread to the investigation. The attacker possessed a terrifying level of patience and discipline. While the authorities grappled with the implications of the stalking footage, a sudden and electrifying development threatened to derail the entire operation. The frantic family members received a series of anonymous text messages, demanding a massive sum of money for the safe return of their loved one. The messages were clinical and threatening, plunging the family into a fresh nightmare of false hope and escalating terror. The federal agents immediately seized control of all communications, initiating an intense digital trace to locate the source of the ransom demands. Hostage negotiation teams were scrambled, operating under the desperate assumption that the victim was still alive and being held captive. The digital hunt was fast and aggressive, cutting through proxy servers and encrypted routing protocols. The cyber division tracked the origin of the messages to a specific physical location. Tactical units breached the address, anticipating a hostage rescue scenario. However, the raid exposed a cruel and devastating twist. The individual apprehended was not the sophisticated stalker captured on the neighborhood cameras. It was an opportunistic criminal who had seen the extensive news coverage and decided to exploit the tragedy for financial gain. The ransom demands were a complete fabrication. The suspect was arrested and charged with extortion, but the true kidnapper remained utterly invisible. This hoax was a crushing blow to the family and a severe complication for the authorities. It drained precious resources and diverted focus during a critical phase of the manhunt. The realization that opportunistic predators were circling the tragedy only deepened the horror of the situation. The true mastermind, the patient stalker who had spent weeks mapping the estate, was still out there holding all the answers. The investigators were back to square one, possessing chilling footage of a ghost and a genetic profile without a name. The sheer cruelty of the fake ransom demands highlighted the chaos surrounding the high-profile investigation. Turn on notifications so you do not miss any breaking updates on this highly active and incredibly complex case. The authorities were forced to reset their strategy, abandoning the hope of a quick, negotiated resolution. The stalking footage from January 11 and January 24 proved that they were dealing with an adversary who planned for every contingency. The fake ransom attempt proved that the widespread media attention was drawing out secondary threats, complicating an already desperate situation. The detectives returned to the cold, hard data. They knew the stalker had to have communicated or navigated using cellular networks during those weeks of preparation. The focus shifted away from direct communication and toward the invisible signals bouncing between the desert communication towers. They needed to find the digital thread that connected the stalker to the surrounding environment. The sheer volume of data generated by a modern community is staggering, but hidden within that noise was the digital echo of the predator. The hunt transitioned into a massive logistical challenge, requiring unprecedented computational power to sift through the invisible records of human movement. The stakes could not be higher, and the adversary had already proven to be disciplined, patient, and incredibly dangerous. Driven by agonizing desperation and the profound silence following the failed ransom hoax, the family took a drastic step to break the stalemate. They authorized the release of a staggering $1 million reward for any information leading to the safe return or the direct identification of the kidnapper. This massive financial incentive was designed to penetrate the criminal underworld and compel anyone harboring secrets to come forward. A reward of that magnitude fundamentally alters the dynamics of loyalty and fear. It was a desperate plea broadcast across national television networks and local channels, hoping that greed might override the self-preservation of an accomplice or a confidant. The sheer size of the bounty underscored the catastrophic reality that traditional investigative avenues were stalling against the disciplined evasion of the suspect. While the public digested the massive financial offer, federal investigators launched one of the most extensive digital dragnets in the history of the region. They secured court orders to pull all cellular transmission data from the towers surrounding the estate and the wider desert perimeter. This operation involved processing tens of thousands of individual data points, every single phone call, text message, and background application ping that occurred during the crucial windows of the January stalking dates, and the night of the abduction was captured in this massive digital net. The goal was to isolate a single anonymous device that shared the same geographic footprint as the masked stalker. The authorities set up dedicated server farms simply to handle the sheer volume of information pouring in from the telecommunications providers. Teams of specialized data scientists worked around the clock, deploying complex algorithms to filter out the innocent neighbors and passing motorists. They were hunting for a burner phone or a device that specifically activated only during the times the suspect was captured on the archival footage. This process is grueling and heavily reliant on computational power to find a needle in an impossibly vast digital haystack. It is a slow, methodical grind through terabytes of raw information. The stark contrast between the violent speed of the initial abduction and the agonizing slowness of the subsequent data analysis created a suffocating atmosphere of tension. The investigators knew that every passing hour degraded the probability of a safe recovery. Despite the promise of a $1 million reward and the unprecedented scope of the federal cellular dragnet, the central terrifying truth remained utterly unchanged. The victim was still completely missing. The massive deployment of advanced technology and overwhelming financial resources had not yet yielded the single piece of actionable intelligence required to locate her whereabouts. The authorities currently hold vast oceans of data. They possess the chilling stalker footage and the crucial unidentified biological profile. Yet the physical reality is that a highly vulnerable individual remains entirely hidden from the combined might of federal law enforcement and intense global media attention. The investigation exists in a state of agonizing suspended animation, where the steady accumulation of complex forensic puzzle pieces has not yet managed to form a coherent or complete picture. The total silence from the actual kidnapper is perhaps the absolute most chilling aspect of the entire prolonged ordeal. There have been no authentic demands, no manifestos, and absolutely no further communication of any kind. The perpetrator simply breached the secure fortress, executed the meticulous plan, and vanished into the silent void, leaving behind an entire affluent community paralyzed by deep fear and profound uncertainty. The sprawling desert landscape surrounding the neighborhood feels fundamentally different now to everyone who lives there. It is no longer viewed as just a beautiful scenic backdrop, but rather as a vast, terrifying hiding place that closely guards the darkest and most violent of secrets. The lingering unease settles heavily over the stalled investigation as the desperate days slowly turn into weeks. The fundamental questions surrounding the motive continue to multiply significantly faster than any concrete answers can be provided by the authorities. How long can a single individual successfully evade a federal data dragnet of this unprecedented magnitude? What was the ultimate psychological or financial purpose driving such a highly orchestrated, incredibly patient, and flawlessly executed operation? The massive, intricate machinery of the justice system is continuously grinding forward, relentlessly processing the thousands of scattered data points. But the actual human element of the tragedy remains painfully and conspicuously absent from the narrative. What this case teaches us about the deeply ingrained illusion of safety in affluent communities is profoundly disturbing. We inherently trust expensive technology to serve as an impenetrable barrier against the outside world. However, this ongoing investigation brutally exposes the extreme fragility of modern digital security architectures. The sophisticated defenses of the estate were completely neutralized, not by advanced cyber hacking, but by simple, decisive, physical intervention. The perpetrator bypassed thousands of dollars in smart technology, simply by reaching out and physically breaking a connection. This demonstrates a massive vulnerability in how we design our personal safety systems. We build digital fortresses that are entirely dependent on exposed physical hardware, creating single points of catastrophic failure. Furthermore, this case clearly highlights how modern law enforcement has fundamentally shifted its operational focus from tracking traditional physical clues to hunting complex digital footprints. The federal detectives are no longer just looking for muddy footprints or discarded tools. They are heavily relying on analyzing tens of thousands of cellular pings and meticulously sifting through terabytes of server data to reconstruct the invisible movements of a suspect. This rapid evolution in investigative methodology requires massive computational resources and unprecedented cooperation from major technology companies. It is a slow, analytical process that starkly contrasts with the immediate, violent nature of the physical crime. The terrifying reality is that a highly prepared, quote, predator who understands exactly how to operate entirely outside of these digital tracking systems can still successfully execute a flawless physical breach. The heavy reliance on invisible data creates a dangerous blind spot when facing a disciplined adversary who simply chooses not to participate in the modern digital ecosystem. Ultimately, the true lesson here is that technology can record a tragedy, but it absolutely cannot physically prevent a monster from stepping out of the dark. As the digital dragnet continues to slowly process mountains of invisible data, the entire complex pursuit ultimately circles back to a single, tangible item resting in a secure evidence locker. The unidentified genetic profile extracted from the discarded glove remains the absolute single most critical physical link to the sophisticated kidnapper. It is a biological signature waiting for a human name to be attached to it. The federal authorities possess the precise cellular blueprint of the predator, but they are currently trapped in an agonizing waiting game. They are desperately waiting for a routine traffic stop, a distant database update, or a minor criminal infraction to finally trigger a decisive match in the national system. Until that digital alarm sounds, the meticulous architect of this terrifying intrusion remains completely free. The haunting question that constantly plagues the investigators and terrifies the community is whether that isolated genetic profile will eventually match an untraceable ghost who crossed state lines, or someone quietly hiding in plain sight within the very community they terrorized. The answer is out there, hidden in the data or walking the streets. Watch this next video where we deeply analyze the complex psychology of targeted stalkers and examine exactly how they meticulously select their victims from the shadows.